Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the latest information on the Medicare Prior Authorization Program. We are now moving into a brave new world here where, for the first time ever, Medicare Prior Authorization, starting tomorrow actually, will be expanded to include orthotic HCPCS codes. So we have been operating in an environment for about a year and a half now where the program has worked, frankly, very successfully. For 6 lower limb prosthetic codes, and we'll get into what those codes are and what we've explored and discovered and learned throughout that process to date. But now, for the first time, we have an expansion into the universe of orthotic HCPCS codes, which creates a whole new set of challenges, a whole new set of processes, and a whole new set of ideas as to how to best implement this program. So my name is Joe McTernan. I am the Director of Coding and Reimbursement Education and Programming here at AOPA. I am joined by my colleague, Devin Bernard, who is the Assistant Director of Coding and Reimbursement Education and Programming, but together we make up the reimbursement and coding team here at AOPA. And we're going to be taking you through the process. We're going to be taking you through the information that you need to know for about the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. So again, we really appreciate you joining us today. If you do have questions, you have 2 options. You can either enter your questions into your dashboard using the questions box. We would prefer that you use the questions box as opposed to the chat function, simply because it's easier to process those questions and answer those questions in a more efficient way. The other option is if you wanted to raise your hand at any point during the webinar. All lines are muted at the moment, but we would be happy to unmute individual lines so that you could answer your question. We probably will address all questions towards the end of today's session, just to allow for the presentation to flow properly. And since it's a relatively short program, there's no harm in waiting until the end to answer your questions. So please be patient as we, please understand that your questions are important and that we will make sure that we have enough time to get to all of the questions. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started with today's session, and we will talk about the 6 steps or the 6 sections that we're going to discuss today. So we're going to talk about the mechanisms of the expansion first. We'll discuss when the program is going to be implemented, with initial implementation actually occurring as of tomorrow, dates of service on or after April 13th. Devin will then take over and cover the process of how to submit a prior authorization request to the DME MAC. He will continue with talking about how you can be best prepared in your O&P practice to be successful in the program. Then I will take the session back, and I will discuss and lead the conversation on what we've learned through the existing lower limb prosthetic prior authorization program that we've been dealing with, or I shouldn't say dealing with, we've been experiencing for about the last 18 months or so. And then Devin will finish up the session and talk about what AOPA resources are available to you as an AOPA member. So that's kind of the outline of the program. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the expansion of the program. So again, for the first time, the program is moving outside of the initial realm of lower limb prosthetic codes. We are moving into orthotic HCPCS codes. So let's talk about how a HCPCS code ends up on what's called the quote-unquote the master list, meaning that it is a code that has been identified by CMS and is eligible for inclusion in a prior authorization program. So there are 3 main criteria. Medicare can't just say, you know what, we don't like LXYZ, so we're going to say that we want to have prior authorization come into play. There's very specific regulatory criteria that has to be met in order for a code to be put onto the master list for prior authorization, which only means that it can be selected. There's many, many more codes on the master list right now than there are codes involved in actual prior authorization. So one of the criteria that has to be in existence is that the code has to be subject to unnecessary utilization. And that's usually determined by recent activity by the cert contractor or a recent high error rate by the cert contractor. It has to be subject to, say, an OIG report, or there has to be significant fraud and abuse investigations that have gone on in the recent past involving a specific HCPCS code. There has to be a high improper payment rate. That is usually determined through audit processes, whether it's cert audits, whether it's TPE audits, whether it's post-payment audits, etc. And there is a minimum monetary threshold. So it has to have either a purchase, an average purchase fee, meaning Medicare reimbursement of $500 or greater, or an average rental fee schedule of $50 or more per month. Now, obviously, O&P devices items are not subject to rental rates, so the $50 per month minimum rental requirement is not in play here for O&P services. So what that translates to is that there are currently 439 O&P total codes that are on what's called the master list of codes that are eligible for inclusion in prior authorization. Of that 439, 234 of them represent orthotic and prosthetic codes. Now that may seem like a lot. You're talking about more than 50% of the codes that are eligible in the entire universe are representative of O&P codes. Bear in mind, however, that for most DME, one code, one product, whereas in O&P, you might have one product described by a combination of 7, 8, 10, even 12 or 13 codes. So that would explain why that might be a little bit skewed. But frankly, orthotics and prosthetics traditionally do have some of the higher fraud, higher improper payment rates because of some of the unscrupulous stuff that's gone out there, like was the subject of Operation Brace Yourself, involving the late night ads with the folks that were selling or offering pain relieving neck or back braces at little or no cost to you. So it's not surprising, is the bottom line, that O&P is one of the higher utilized codes and therefore one of the more prevalent codes on the master list. So there are currently 102 orthotic codes that are on the master list. There are 132 prosthetic codes. But only 6 of those codes are currently, as of today, subject to prior authorization, and those are the 6 prosthetic codes that we will talk about a little bit later on today. So that will be moved from 6 codes to 11 codes as of tomorrow in a handful of states. Okay, so what are the 5 codes that are being included in this latest expansion or in this new expansion? So 2 of them are spinal codes. One is LO648, which is an LSO, off-the-shelf LSO, LO650, which is another LSO that has additional control involved. That is also an off-the-shelf or OTS spinal orthosis. There are 3 knee orthosis codes. 2 of them are OTS. One is L1832. The other is L1833, and the final one is L1851. So of those 3 codes, L1833 and L1851 represent OTS or off-the-shelf knee orthoses, and L1832 represents the only custom-fitted, fit with expertise required orthosis that is on the 5 codes that are moving into the universe of prior authorization. Now, ironically, the 4 OTS codes are also already subject to competitive bidding. So it's important to keep in mind that if you are going to provide any of these 4 codes that are the 4 OTS codes that are subject to prior authorization, you must be a Medicare approved bid winner for competitive bidding, or you must be providing those to patients who reside in a non-competitive bidding area. So that's an important thing to remember here. So why are we talking about these 5 codes? And the 5 codes specifically, when you take a look at the utilization, it's really, really not too hard to figure out why these codes are included in prior authorization. These are 5 codes that have extremely high utilization, high fraud and abuse especially involving what I talked about earlier with the Operation Brace Yourself. So in the 2019 report that came out of the DOJ, Operation Brace Yourself had approximately $1.7 billion in fraudulent claims submitted to Medicare or paid by Medicare for orthoses that were either never provided or were provided without any or little to no documentation supporting the actual medical need. These were criminal elements who were just running a criminal operation involving physicians who were writing random scripts and were just providing as much as they possibly could, sometimes having 3, 4, 5 braces show up on a patient's doorstep. So these codes also are subject to significant improper payment rates through the CERT audit activity. LSOs are in the top 20 consistently. You are talking about 60% improper payment range on the lumbar orthoses, a 32% improper payment rate on the LSOs. So both of these products, both of these product categories are definitely meeting the criteria for inclusion in that master list, and it's not really hard to understand logically why they would be included in a prior authorization process. So with that, let's talk about the start dates of the program. So we have 3 dates that are important for you to know. One is literally upon us, and that is the initial implementation of the prior authorization program for these 5 codes goes into effect in one state in each of the 4 DME MAC jurisdictions. That is New York for jurisdiction A, Illinois for jurisdiction B, Florida for jurisdiction C, and California for jurisdiction D. So if you are in one of those states and you are going to provide one of these braces tomorrow or any date in the future, you cannot do so unless you have a prior authorization, affirmative prior authorization decision on file, whether it is a competitively bid situation or not. It is now a condition of payment in these 4 states for dates of service on or after April 13th. With that in mind, Medicare did open up the submission window on March 30th. So if you were anticipating delivery, you could have submitted your prior authorization request as early as March 30th. The second phase of rollout and the implementation will occur in an additional 8 states, I believe it is, additional 2 states in each of the jurisdictions. That will occur with dates of service effective as of or on July 12th of 2022. And those states are Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Missouri, Arizona, and Washington. And I'm sorry, I said 8 states. It's an additional 12 states. I apologize. It's 3 more states in each of the jurisdictions. And then finally, October 10th is your nationwide implementation date. So anybody, anywhere in the United States with a date of service on or after October 10th will be subject to Medicare prior authorization for these 5 additional HCPCS codes. Okay. Okay, with that, I am going to turn the presentation over to Devin, who's going to walk you through the process of submitting your prior authorizations. This is something that should not necessarily be new for folks that have already experienced it with lower limb prosthetics, but there are some nuances that are a little bit different. So with that, I will turn it over to Devin.
All right. Thanks for all that great information and background, Joe. Now that we know the codes and we know the implementation dates, the next step is to learn about the prior authorization process or kind of review it, as it is going to be very similar to the program that's already in place for lower limb prosthetics, as Joe had mentioned, with only a couple little minor changes here and there in terms of turnaround times and the window for submitting your claims and delivering once you receive your authorization request. To review the prior authorization process, we're going to break it down into its core parts. We're going to look at the requested documentation, or what needs to be included with your request, how you submit your required documentation. Then we'll kind of talk about how long the DME MACs will take to review your submissions and provide you with response, and then talk about those possible outcomes or responses, and then the final steps of submitting your claims for payment. Now, as we go over the steps, just remember that they are going to be the same whether you are a participating provider or a non-participating provider, and whether you are accepting assignment or not accepting assignment. The reason they're going to be the same across all of these is because prior authorization is a regulatory standard and a condition of payment. So it's going to be across the board. If you are submitting a claim to Medicare for any of these braces, whether that's primary or secondary or whatnot, you're going to be required to obtain prior authorization. So first up is the required documentation you need to submit as part of your request. All prior authorization requests must include the following documentation and information to avoid any possible delays in processing. You must have some general beneficiary information, and this includes the patient's name. This will include the patient's Medicare number or their MBI number. We must also include their date of birth. And lastly, you're going to include or list their state of residence. This is very important, especially in the early stages of the program as it's being rolled out in phases. And the need for a prior authorization request is based on the patient's primary home address, which includes their state of residence, and not your facility. So submitting a prior authorization request is going to be based on where that patient resides, not where the service is being provided and delivered. So for the patient's basic information, in essence, it should all match what is on their Medicare ID cards. You also want to need to provide some basic information about yourself, such as your facility's name, the facility's address, your phone number. Then you also must provide the primary contact or the person who the DME Max should contact or talk to if there are any issues or questions about the prior authorization request. You also have to provide your PTN number or your supplier number, and also your MPI number. Then you also have to kind of list out some basic or include some basic miscellaneous or general information. That's going to be the HCPCS codes for one of the 5 items. And it's possible to have more than one code on a request, but you only need to list the codes subject to prior authorization. So you don't need to include all the other addition codes associated with your claim. You only need to include that base orthosis code. So if your request is going to involve more than one HCPCS code requiring prior authorization, so maybe they need, bilateral braces, or if they need a spinal brace and a knee orthosis, multiple requests or multiple cover sheets are not going to be required. You'll simply indicate which codes are to be covered by your request on the cover sheet. You also need to list out the request submission date, or the date you are filling out the forms and submitting your information, and then the type of submission that this request will cover, whether that's going to be your initial request, or if it's going to be an expedited request due to emergency situations, or if it's a resubmission of a previous request to fix errors or omissions. You'll also be required to provide some information about the treating practitioner or physician, such as their name and their MPI number. Now, all this required general information about the patient, you, and the type of submission and all that can be covered by using one of the DME Max prior authorization submission or cover sheets. This is kind of what the CGS cover sheet will look like. This is kind of what the Noridian cover sheet is going to look like. As you can see, it has all that required information that we just spoke about. Next up, for your must include information is going to be a copy of your valid standard written order. I'm not going to go into great detail about the standard written orders, but just remember that the valid standard written order must include the patient's name or their MBI number, the order date, a general description of what is being provided, and that can be the HCPCS code and descriptor, just the HCPCS code, or just the descriptor. It could be a brand name or model name, or it can be a narrative description. Then you also need to have the physician's or practitioner's name or their MPI number and their signature as well. Now, having the SWO prior to delivery or a written order prior to delivery instead of having it prior to your billing may be a little bit of a shift from your normal procedures or your normal practices. So you want to kind of take note of this change that, you know, for any of these 5 codes, you're now going to have that written order prior to delivery, because you're going to need it to be included with your prior authorization request. Then lastly, you must include any and all pertinent information that demonstrates the medical necessity for the brace in question, and this will include the notes from, you know, your record or your charts, physician's records and notes, OT notes, PT notes, hospital notes, or anything else that you have that would help show the medical necessity of the item and to demonstrate that all policy criteria has been met. You know, the prior authorization process doesn't create any new documentation requirements, and the current documentation requirements, you know, remain unchanged. The process just changes when that documentation must be submitted for review. So kind of be sure to review the documentation requirements found in the KO policy and the spinal policy to kind of get set and get ready for all this, to make sure you are familiar with what constitutes medical necessity and coverage criteria for the 5 items that we're discussing here today. So who may ask for or submit a prior authorization request? Obviously, you as the supplier and biller may request one. However, the patient may also request one on their own as well if they're going to be submitting the claim on their own, but predominantly you would be the one doing it. You have a couple options available or methods available to you when submitting your prior authorization request to the DME MACs for review. You can mail them in to the DME MAC. You can use a fax machine, still fax them in. If you're set up for electronic submission of medical documentation or ESMD, you may use your ESMD system, or most likely what everyone will probably be using or is currently using would be one of the dedicated DME MAC provider portals. Just keep in mind that if you wish to use your DME MAC's dedicated portal, you're going to have to sign up and register for it. And these portals do allow for easy access and tracking of your request. If you want more information on the portals or how to register and use them, just simply visit your DME MAC website. In addition, if you use the portals, and you would not need to complete the separate or individual cover sheet, as the portal collects all that information already for you. And then lastly, kind of keep in mind that typically how you submit your request is going to be how the DME MACs are going to correspond to you about your request. Once again, you have to determine which method works best for you, or which method you are most comfortable with using, whether that's mailing it, faxing it, or kind of using one of the dedicated MAC portals. Once the DME MACs receive your cover sheet information, your SWO, and all the other pertinent medical record information for medical necessity, they will review all the information and respond to your request with either an affirmative, meaning you passed and received prior authorization and that you showed that medical necessity has been met and you show that policy criteria has been met, or you'll receive a non-affirmed, meaning something needs to be fixed or addressed, or something went wrong and that you did not pass the prior authorization. For these select orthotic codes, the established turnaround time for the review has been set at about 5 business days. This kind of cuts in half the time that's being used for the lower limb prostheses. Those are set at about 10, but for these codes, the turnaround time has been set at 5 days. As I said before, the review is no different than the current review process for KO and spinal claims, meaning the claims are still being checked against the requirements that are in policy, and there's nothing else or nothing new. This will include things like checks for, same or similar as well. It must be noted that the decision time frame is based on when the DME MAC receives the request for review and not when the request was submitted. So once they receive it is when that 5 business days kind of starts kicking up. In addition, that time frame for any decision is based on business days, not calendar days. So that's not going to include, federal holidays and weekends. It is truly set to business days. Okay, so once they reviewed it, it's time for your response. The DME MAC will send decision letters to the supplier, you or anyone else that's made that request within that appropriate time frame of about 5 days, maybe less, depending on the type of request. Each decision letter will include a unique tracking number, or a UTN, which will be required for your claim submission, as it is your proof or record that you have followed the prior authorization process for payment, and also that everything has been done and everything has been accounted for. And then also that letter would include a detailed explanation or rationale for why your prior authorization request was deemed to be not valid or found to be non-affirmed if your request was unfavorable. Keep in mind that all prior authorization decision letters will be sent to the address that's on file with the National Supplier Clearinghouse, or the NSC, and not the address that was provided on your portal request or your DME MAC cover sheet. Once you received your response letter, the clock starts ticking. What I mean by that is you must deliver that approved item within 60 days. In other words, the prior authorization decision remains valid for 60 calendar days. If the HCPCS codes or the brace in question is not delivered within that 60 days, or it's after that 60 days, then you must submit a brand new prior authorization request and begin that process over. But it has to be kind of stressed that this is 60 calendar days, not 60 business days. So there is that difference. But once again, if it takes you longer than 60 days to deliver the item associated with your request, you're going to have to get a brand new prior authorization process started and get a brand new UTN number. And then for your claim submission, nothing changes in the sense that you still have up to 1 year to submit your timely claim. How do you submit your claims with an affirmed and non-affirmed prior authorization request? If a prior authorization request is found to be favorable and receives the affirmative decision, you may proceed with your claim submission for the brace in question and all associated addition codes. When submitting the claim to your appropriate DME MAC, you must include the unique tracking number, or UTN, which was provided with your decision letter or your decision outcome. If your claim does not include this UTN, it will be denied. In other words, it cannot be processed, it will be denied. If you are submitting a paper claim, the UTN number would be placed in the first 14 blocks or spaces of box 23. If you're submitting the claim electronically, the unique tracking number or UTN would be placed into the loop 23 or loop 24, depending on how it's being processed by your um, clearinghouse or billing software. So you want to make sure you check with those entities to ensure that you are placing your UTN into the proper channel or proper loop, and then the claim will be processed as normal. Now, if your claim receives an affirmative prior authorization, it will most likely not deny in the future for medical necessity reasons. However, it could possibly deny for other technical reasons, meaning something like, you know, proof of delivery was invalid, or you had the wrong place of service, you know, information that was not available during the prior authorization request. Now, affirmative request also provides the claim with some protection from, you know, future audits, either prepayment or post-payment. However, there are still slight chances that the claim could be audited, especially if it is determined somehow or somewhere along the line that there is a potential for fraud or inappropriate billing patterns being identified. But typically, if you received a affirmative prior authorization, they should be pretty safe from future claims or future audits. Excuse me here. If you received the non-affirmative request, or you had the non-affirm, meaning it did not pass the request, you kind of have some options available to you. Once again, you will receive a detailed decision letter explaining the non-affirmative decision and a unique tracking number. You may kind of then review that detailed decision letter and make any required adjustments or changes, and then resubmit that request for review. And then the turnaround response for that time would also be 5 business days. And then there's going to be no limit to the amount of times that you can kind of resubmit your prior authorization request to get an affirmative. So option 1 to you, available to you, is you review that prior authorization non-affirmative response letter, including what went wrong or things like that, and then you can kind of go back, make those corrections or address what has been missing, and then resubmit it for review again and hope for an affirmative response the second time around. You may also elect to not resubmit the request and proceed with delivering the brace in question and submitting the claim. In this scenario, you would still submit the claim to the appropriate DME MAC and include the unique tracking number on the claim. Once again, if it's paper, it goes into box 23. If it's electronic, you're using loops 23 and 24. In this scenario, the brace in question will be denied, but you may appeal the denial and go ahead and bill or secondary if it's a secondary payer involved. But you might want to start thinking about in these type of scenarios that you know the item is already going to be considered not medically necessary based on that decision letter. So you may want to consider having the patient sign an ABN and submitting that claim with the GA modifier and that UTA number as well. And then use that rationale provided to you and that non-affirmative as the reason why you feel that claim might possibly be denied for medical necessity. Just as a reminder, if a claim for a HCPCS code subject to prior authorization is submitted without a prior authorization request and a corresponding unique tracking number, it will automatically be denied. So you may not use an ABN to try and bypass the authorization process. Also, if a claim is submitted without the prior authorization request, it will be denied and cannot be appealed. Only claims with a request that are denied can be appealed. With your initial submission, any subsequent resubmissions of fixed errors or deficiencies, the decision turnaround is going to be 5 days. But in some cases or in emergencies, you may require a quicker turnaround, and you may request what is called an expedited review, and this will allow for a 2-day turnaround and not the typical 5 days. If you are requesting an expedited review, you must explain how the delays in the review and response could jeopardize the health or the situation of the beneficiary. Then all other steps for a unique tracking number and claim submission remain the same. This normal expedited process may be okay for some items and services when the patient could possibly wait for a few days. However, we do understand that, the select KOs and the select spinal braces within this program are sometimes delivered in true emergency or emergent situations, and it may not be possible to get an expedited response, or that the patient cannot wait a day or two. We have expressed these concerns with high-ranking CMS officials and the DME Max, and we're still working on a possible solution. I was checking updates right up until we started this presentation, hoping something that would have come out. They have been very receptive and cooperative and seem to understand the situation. However, at this time, they still have not provided an alternative solution outside the expedited review process. But in those situations where it is that dire emergency and the patient needs it immediately, you either have to do the expedited or submit it and have to try to appeal it later on. But once again, it would not be paid. There would not be the opportunity to do a retroactive type of authorization request. So let's recap the process. First, you must fill out and complete the basic information on the cover sheets and compile all the needed medical necessity documentation and the SWO. Step 2 is you submit the cover sheet and all of your information. Third, the DME MAC responds within 2 to 5 business days, depending on the type of submission, whether that's expedited or regular or resubmission. Next, you receive your positive affirmation or your positive results and a UTN with your response letter, or you receive a non-affirmative decision with a detailed letter outlining why and your UTN. And then lastly, you submit your claim with your UTN number. If it was non-affirmed, you can resubmit your request with the appropriate edits or fixes made. Lastly, just to point out or reiterate, if a claim receives an affirmative prior authorization request, it will most likely not deny in future medical necessity for future medical necessity reasons. However, it could still possibly deny for other technical reasons, such as improper proof of delivery, improper place of service, or the brace that you provided was not approved or reviewed by the PDAC or not listed on the PDAC product classification list. And also, as I said earlier, most of these would be protected from future audits. The only time you may get an audit for these might be, as I said, if there's inappropriate patterns identified or potential fraud, or if it's kind of like a cert audit, because remember, the cert audits are going to be kind of random anyways. Okay, so that takes care of the process. Now we're going to kind of give you some tips on how you can kind of get prepared and get ready for the rollout of the orthotic expansion of prior authorization. The first thing you want to do is to make sure you are aware of the implementation dates that Joe kind of talked about and when it will be time for you to start submitting a request. Also, if your practice sees patients from multiple states, be sure you're aware of when prior authorization started in your patient's state, since the request is going to be based on where that patient is residing and not where your facility is. It's important to stress that there are no retroactive requests. So if you miss an implementation date and don't submit a prior authorization request prior to your delivery, you're most likely not going to be able to get reimbursed for it. So pay attention to those implementation dates, including the start dates of when you may begin to submit your requests. Take the time to double check your current documentation practices and see if anything needs to be updated or corrected. Kind of go back and check previous audit results and see what areas you may need to fix or update, or where you might need to bolster or add additional documentations. You want to be sure that you create consistent processes in obtaining that documentation and in your own documentation. You want to make sure that you've noted that you will require that SWO prior to delivery instead of prior to billing, because that might be a change for some. And be sure that the documentation supports the face-to-face visit encounters, meaning that there's been that face-to-face encounters within the last 6 months. Review the local coverage determinations and policy articles for KOs and spinals. Plus, don't forget to review that standard documentation article for the elements of an SWO, and to make sure that you understand what is needed and that you're not missing out any small details on those orders. For example, make sure that your documentation for a spinal brace pinpoints or highlights at least one of the approved reasons for why a back brace would be considered medically necessary. Also, if the brace requires PDAC approval, be sure you are verifying the approval. You should not need to submit this information for your approval process, but it must be available if requested. With the KOs, you want to be sure that you are capturing, the correct diagnosis for the brace you're providing, and if you've documented what the recent injury is, or if that patient has had the surgery and whatnot. Also, it's not required, as I stated, it's not going to be required for your prior authorization requests, but be sure you are documenting the type of fitting occurring at the time of delivery. And don't forget that for claims with a date of service on or after October 10th, so when the final implementation starts for across all regions and countries, the 3 KOs do require PDAC coding verification. So those braces that are going to be subject to prior authorization after the final implementation date of October 10th, they do require PDAC coding verification, even though that's currently not listed in the KO policy. That was a recent announcement by the DME Max and the PDACs. Excuse me, the PDAC. Also be sure that you take a look at some of the general reasons a claim receives a non-affirmative prior authorization request, and be sure to avoid, those mistakes or errors, especially kind of the last 4 here on the slide. Be sure you send your request to the proper DME MAC, the DME MAC jurisdiction or state where your patient lives is the DME MAC in charge of handling the request, not the DME MAC in which you are located and providing care. As you stated before, make sure you have your written order prior to delivery or your SWO. It has all that required elements and that you're submitting all of your proper documentation. Make sure that all that documentation that includes yours and the physician's notes have been signed and dated. Every entry must be signed and dated by the person who made the entry. And if you are using addendums or amendments, make sure that those are done properly, meaning that they are tied to a specific entry. They're noted as amendments or addendums, and that they're signed and dated as well. So, that kind of takes care of that process. So now I'm going to kind of turn it and how to get prepared as well. So now I'll turn it back over to Joe so he can kind of tell you what we've learned from the previous prior authorization.
Awesome. Thanks, Devin. So, yeah, I mean, I have the actual benefit of giving really, really good news here. So we've now been in an environment for 6 lower limb prosthetic codes for about 18 months where prior authorization has been a fact of life. And it's actually been a very successful program to date. Claim denials, because prior authorization is being required, are way, way down. But what we've learned through the process is that, to their credit, the DME MACs have done a really good job of handling this process efficiently. So what we found is that out of all of the submissions for the lower limb prosthetic program, about 80% of those submissions are being approved on the first submission. Now, remember, folks, we're not talking about very basic componentry here. We're talking about four codes that describe components that have microprocessor control built into their description, and then 2 additional codes that describe pretty high-end prosthetic feet. So the fact that 80% of initial submissions are being affirmed is really, really great news and really tells a good story about how the program is working. Expanding on that, very, very few claims actually require more than 1 resubmission. So about 95% or more of the claims are being approved, or the prior authorization submissions are being affirmed, positively affirmed, upon the first resubmission. So it's extremely rare that a prior authorization request has to go through resubmission more than once, which means that if 95% are being approved, that means that very few of these codes are actually ultimately being denied, because once you have a prior authorization affirmation, unless there's a technical reason like a proof of delivery or a non-code PDAC verified product being used, it's highly, highly unlikely that that claim will ultimately be denied. In fact, if it does, you have immediate grounds for an appeal, because the prior authorization is essentially, I want to say essentially, a guarantee that medical necessity has been met. 10 days is the time frame for prosthetics. Now, we know it's going to be a little bit more difficult with a self-set goal of 5 days for the 5 orthotic codes. But what we found is that on average, claims, prior authorization requests on the prosthetic side are taking 4 days. Not expedited requests, but regular submissions are being processed on average in about 4 days' time. So they are cutting the processing time by more than half of what they are, quote unquote, allotted in order to make that decision. So that's all really, really good news. It's been a very successful program. It's been to all accounts, it's been beneficial not only to the Medicare program, who is protecting the trust fund, but to providers who are now not having to lay out huge costs without really any idea of whether they're actually going to recoup that and get paid. And for beneficiaries who are not having to wait on the prosthetic side, an unreasonable amount of time to receive their prosthesis. In fact, a 4-day turnaround time typically shouldn't be impacting delivery at all. So we've learned nothing but good things to date, and we are hopeful that that will continue to go as we move forward with some of the nuances and complications that are involved on the orthotic side of the equation. So we're looking forward to seeing that. We absolutely want everybody's feedback as this process gets underway, so that we can make sure that we're on top of it and that we're communicating that information with both CMS and the DME MACs. Okay. All right. So I'm going to pass it back to Devin, who's going to wrap us up, and then we will address some of the questions, really good questions that have come through so far in the question box, and we'll open it up for folks to ask some questions live if they'd like to.
All right, there, I'm gonna start speaking without unmuting myself. I caught myself quickly. Now on to the last part of today's presentation. As Joe kind of pointed out, the resources or things that kind of help you learn a little bit more about the process, or kind of figure out what you need to do to get started again. besides reviewing and looking at the Medicare LCDs and policy articles, there are some other resources you may use to help you get ready for and to help you understand the process in more detail and to help ensure an affirmative response on your first attempt or at least on your second prior authorization request attempt. First are your DME MAC documentation checklists for the KOs and spinal braces. These will help ensure that you are obtaining all the documentation needed to support medical necessity and coverage criteria for your brace in particular. So you can kind of look at, a snapshot instead of the whole policy in general. These are kind of good little cheat sheets or summaries of the policy, so they'll kind of help you make sure that you're getting what you need for each of those kind of braces without having to go through and check and read through the whole policy. Each of the DME MACs also have a dedicated page for prior authorizations, and this will include checklists or tools to make sure you have and are including all the required information for your request. So this will be a checklist to ensure that you have the cover sheets, the SWO, or in this case, the written order prior to deliveries, the WOPDs, and any and all of your supporting medical necessity documentation. The pages will also provide you with tips and guidance on how to access and sign up for their portals if you choose to go that route. Next are your response letters from the DME MACs about your requests. As we said kind of during the presentation, a non-affirmed response will include a detailed letter as to why the response was not in the positive. Like it will tell you you're missing your written order, or your written order is invalid, or you haven't documented, the patient is ambulatory or something like that. You can then go back and fix those and address them as they are going to be clearly identified by that response letter. So kind of use those to kind of look through and make any changes if you go through a resubmission. You can check the CMS page for prior authorization and check out two very important or helpful documents. One is the operational guide, and then the other is the frequently asked questions document. The operational guide provides detailed information on how the prior authorization program works and how it works under different conditions and scenarios. And they have a dedicated section for prosthetics, and they have a dedicated section towards these orthosis. And we also have taken out the pertinent information and kind of shrunk it down and created just a operational guide sort of the lower limb process, and one for just the orthoses, and one for just the prosthetics, and we kind of have those up and available on our website for you to use. And also, we will make recordings of these presentations available for you to kind of go back and re-review them. We will be having more of these in the future, especially as more information comes out, and hopefully we will have information very quickly or shortly about what to do in those emergent care situations. But you can also reach out to Joe and I kind of directly as well as a resource to help you with any of your prior authorization questions. So thank you for attending today's presentation. And once again, if you run into any problems or issues with the program, please let us know. We're kind of here to kind of help you. So let me turn it over, Joe, get you back on the line here and give some last minute sage advice and get ready to go over some questions.
Yeah, so no, I'm here, and I think we can go right into some of the general pain points that I've picked up by monitoring the question box as we have gone through the presentation today. But if folks do have a question that they would like to ask and they feel comfortable speaking on the microphone, if you want to throw your hand up in your dashboard, there is a raise hand button, and we can take some live questions. We do have a few minutes. But some of the general pain points that I've heard today is involving ABN use. And we do understand that some of these situations are just unfortunate, but the rules are what the rules are. So you cannot use an ABN to protect yourself or shift liability to the patient if the patient says, you know what, I don't want you to submit a prior authorization request because I don't want to wait for this brace. I want it right now, right here. The Medicare rules on the ABN, because because the prior authorization submission is an actual condition of payment, an ABN does not protect you there. Now, the patient can make a conscious decision to waive their Medicare benefits and pay you cash for that brace and walk out of your office with that brace in their hand. The downside of that is that if they come back a week later and they say, you know what, I've changed my mind, I want you to submit a claim to Medicare for that brace, you then remain obligated, and you have not submitted a prior authorization request, and you are not going to get reimbursed for that brace, and then you are then obligated, because the patient has changed their mind, to refund the patient. I get that that's not an ideal situation, that's not a fair situation, but the only time the ABN can be used to shift financial liability in this scenario is when you've submitted a prior authorization request and that has been non-affirmed. At that point, you have a tracking number that's been issued. You've fulfilled your obligation to submit the prior authorization request, and then you can use the ABN to tell the patient, hey, look, Medicare has deemed this not medically necessary through prior authorization. We can still provide it to you, but you have to sign this ABN in order to accept financial liability. So that's one pain point that I've heard. The second one is clearly the emergent need situation. And trust me, folks, we get it. We have been all over CMS on this issue since this first release about prior authorization came out. And to their credit, they get it. They have repeatedly said, we absolutely understand there is limited need, typically in an emergency room situation, which is outpatient. Some same-day surgery, although usually you have enough advance warning in that scenario when the surgery is scheduled to complete that process. But when there is a true emergent need, CMS has absolutely acknowledged there needs to be some kind of process outside of the 2-day expedited review process to cover those specific emergent needs. We've suggested perhaps a modifier. We've suggested a retroactive approach. Long story short, they still don't have a solution. They said they're working on it. I've checked with them every day. Devin is checking with them regularly, checking the frequently asked questions regularly. We are hopeful that within days we're going to have a solution. I know this does not help you if you are in New York, Florida, Illinois, or California, and I am sorry about that. I wish I had another solution. We are hopeful we're going to have a solution that's going to be retroactively effective. So those are the two pain points that I've heard. I think that covers the majority of the questions that we received in the questions box. Let me take a quick look. Devin, do you see any that I've missed?
No, Joe, that kind of pretty much sums them up. We have a couple more that are kind of coming in as you're talking, and I'm kind of getting back for them. But once again, they are kind of still within that vein of the use of the ABN. There was kind of one good question here that kind of talked about, the authorization request for a secondary payer situation, Medicare secondary payer. That seems kind of odd that you kind of have to wait or delay. But remember, you can't submit your prior authorization request, before you get all your information back from the primary payer. So you don't have to wait to get all of that back. You can submit that request right away to Medicare, and then you just submit it with the normal secondary payer information.
So there's actually a really good question in here that just came up in the questions box. It says, we were told in the case of planned surgery that you are not allowed to submit the prior authorization request until the surgery is complete, as the medical necessity does not occur until the surgery. Is that not correct? If you are being told that by a DME MAC representative, please let us know, and you can let us know offline, because we really do need to address that. That's not a situation that's going to be helpful to anyone, and they should be able to make an assumed prior authorization decision based on the nature of the surgery that's planned, And then obviously if that surgery doesn't occur, any affirmative decision based on that expectation of surgery would be subject to denial for technical reasons down the road. So Adam McFarland, I hope I'm not meaning to call you out, but if you have the opportunity to follow up with us offline, I think that would be helpful.
And also remember that if I'm hearing the question or reading the question properly, in those situations, in most cases, you would not be billing Medicare anyways. Those would be billed to the facility, so you would not need to do the prior authorization in those specific cases unless you are going to do it, prior to the surgery and have it immediately following the surgery and they're being discharged.
Well, and also if the surgery is being performed in an outpatient setting, it would apply as well. Good point, there's been a follow-up that says that this was talked about in a Noridian seminar, so we will follow up with Noridian on that, and we will provide some specific feedback on that issue. I can understand where that comes from, but that's not something that's got to be, that can't be acceptable. There has to be another option there. So that's something we will address. That's really good information to have. And these are things that we're going to learn that are unique to an orthosis that didn't necessarily apply to the prosthetic side. So, all right. So with that, guys, I don't see any hands raised. Nobody's feeling particularly bold to ask a question out loud, but we will, if we didn't answer your question in the questions box, it's because we feel that we addressed it pretty significantly verbally, but we will do our best to follow up with any folks. And if you didn't receive an answer or you feel that you need more clarification, please feel free to reach out to Devin or myself. My email is jmcternan@aopennet.org. That's jmcternan@aopennet.org. Devin is dbernard@aopennet.org. And if you didn't write down fast enough, you can find those email addresses on the AOPA website. So with that, I think we can wrap today's session. I hope you found it informative. Look for more resources, more information coming out on this issue as we learn more, specifically about the emergent need situation. As soon as we have any information on that, we will be sure to communicate that out to you all as our members. So appreciate you all spending an hour with us today, and sorry if we went over by a couple minutes, but really good information and good questions. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.